I never thought the cruelest words I'd ever hear would come from my own son's mouth at my husband's funeral. But there I was, standing beside Richard's casket, tears streaming down my face, when David leaned close and whispered words that cut deeper than any knife. "You're nothing without Dad, you know that, right?" The funeral home was filled with Richard's colleagues, our neighbors, family, friends, all there to pay their respects to a man who'd built his life with dignity and purpose. And there was David, my only child, choosing that sacred moment to deliver his judgment on my worth. I stood there in my black dress, clutching my purse, feeling smaller than I'd ever felt in my 62 years. The grief was already crushing me, but David's words, they were something else entirely. They weren't just cruel, they were calculated, as if he'd been waiting for his father to die just to tell me how worthless I was. But what David didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that his father and I had kept certain things private for very good reasons. And in about 3 minutes, when the lawyer read Richard's final wishes aloud, David was going to learn just how wrong he was about everything. Let me back up and tell you how we got here. Richard and I had been married for 38 years. He was a quiet man, methodical, the kind of person who planned every detail of his life with precision. David always saw his father as the provider, the decision-maker, the head of the household. In his mind, I was just there, the wife who cooked dinner and kept house while the real business of living happened around me. Over the years, David had developed this attitude that I was somehow dependent on Richard for everything. When we'd have family dinners, David would address all the serious questions to his father. "Dad, what do you think about the market? Dad, should I refinance my house? Dad, how should I handle this situation with my boss?" I might as well have been invisible. When Richard was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 6 months ago, David immediately assumed he'd need to take control of everything. He started showing up at the house unannounced, going through our mail, asking pointed questions about our finances. He'd sit at our kitchen table with his laptop, making calls about insurance policies and medical bills like he was already the man of the house. "Don't worry, Mom," he'd say, patting my hand like I was a child. "I'll handle the important stuff, you just focus on taking care of Dad." The important stuff. As if 38 years of marriage, of building a life together, of making decisions as partners, as if none of that qualified as important. But I stayed quiet. I took care of Richard through his treatments, through the pain, through those final weeks when he could barely keep his eyes open. I held his hand when the doctors delivered bad news. I was the one who stayed up all night when he couldn't sleep, who adjusted his pillows and brought him water and made sure he took his medications on time. David would visit for an hour on weekends, check his phone constantly, and then leave with some comment about how hard this must be for you, Mom, not being able to do much to help. Not being able to do much to help. I was doing everything. 3 days before Richard died, he squeezed my hand and whispered, "Margaret, promise me you won't let David push you around after I'm gone." I promised him I wouldn't, but honestly, I wasn't sure how I'd manage it. Richard had always been the one to stand up to David when our son got too demanding or condescending. Without him, I felt like I was going to be completely at David's mercy. That's exactly what David was counting on. The funeral service was beautiful. Richard would have approved of everything, the flowers, the music, the pastor's words about a life well lived. People came up to me afterward, sharing memories of Richard, telling me what a good man he'd been, how sorry they were for my loss. And through it all, David hovered, not to comfort me but to manage me. He'd interrupt conversations to tell people, "Mom's pretty overwhelmed right now." He'd answer questions directed at me. He'd put his hand on my arm and guide me away from people who might have wanted to talk longer. "We need to keep this moving," he'd whisper. "You can't handle too much of this." After the graveside service, we returned to the funeral home for the reading of Richard's will. This was standard procedure. Richard's lawyer, Mr. Patterson, had arranged to meet with the family immediately after the services to go over the basic details. David had been particularly interested in this part. Over the past few months, he'd made several comments about making sure Mom is taken care of and hoping Dad set things up so you won't have to worry about money. But there was something in his tone that suggested he was really thinking about how the inheritance would affect him. We sat in Mr. Patterson's office, me, David, David's wife Carol, and a few other family members. Mr. Patterson opened the will with the usual legal language, the formal declarations that this was Richard's final testament. And then he got to the part that made David's face go white. "To my beloved wife Margaret, who has been my partner in all things, I leave the entirety of my estate, including all properties, investments, and business holdings." David leaned forward in his chair. "Wait, what do you mean properties? Dad only owned our family house." Mr. Patterson adjusted his glasses. "Actually, Mr. Thompson owns several properties. The family residence, yes, but also the rental properties in downtown Portland, the commercial building on 5th Street, and the vacation home in Bend." "Rental properties?" David's voice cracked. "What rental properties?" "Your father owned 6 apartment buildings in the Pearl District. He purchased them over the past 15 years as investment properties. The rental income has been substantial. Carol grabbed David's arm. How substantial? Mr. Patterson looked at his papers. The combined value of all properties is approximately $8.2 million. The annual rental income alone is just over $400,000. David's mouth fell open. He turned to stare at me like he'd never seen me before. Furthermore, Mr. Patterson continued, Mrs. Thompson is the sole owner and CEO of Thompson Holdings, LLC, which manages all of these properties as well as several other business investments. CEO, David's voice was barely a whisper now. Your father established the company 5 years ago, but your mother has been the primary decision-maker for all business operations. The company employs 12 people and has been consistently profitable. I sat there quietly, watching my son process this information. The man who had just told me I was nothing without his father was learning that I had been running a multi-million-dollar business while he thought I was just keeping house. But I never knew, David stammered. Mr. Patterson looked at me, then back at David. Your parents chose to keep their business affairs private. Mrs. Thompson, your father left specific instructions that I should explain your role in the company to the family. I finally spoke up, my voice steady despite the grief still weighing on my heart. Your father and I built this together, David. Every decision, every investment, every property purchase, we made those choices as a team. I wasn't just along for the ride, I was driving half the time. David's face had gone completely white. Carol was gripping his arm so tightly her knuckles were white too. The family house, David said weakly. Surely I inherit the family house. Mr. Patterson shook his head. The family house belongs entirely to your mother, as does everything else. However, there is a provision for you. David sat up straighter, hope flickering in his eyes. Your father has left you his watch collection and his tools with an estimated value of about $3,000. He also established a small trust fund that will provide you with $500 per month for the next 5 years, provided you maintain respectful and regular contact with your mother. $500? David's voice was barely audible. That's it. I reached into my purse and pulled out a letter. Your father asked me to give this to you after the will was read. David took the envelope with shaking hands and read the letter silently. As he read, his face grew even paler and I could see tears forming in his eyes. When he finished, he looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the condescending look I'd grown used to, not the impatient dismissal, but something that looked almost like respect. What does it say? Carol demanded. David folded the letter carefully. It says that Dad hoped this would teach me to never underestimate the people I love, and that if I want to have any relationship with Mom going forward, I need to start treating her like the intelligent, capable woman she's always been. The room was completely quiet except for the sound of Carol's sharp breathing. I stood up slowly, smoothing my black dress. David, you told me at your father's funeral that I was nothing without him, but the truth is, your father was never the one making the big decisions about our money or our future. We made those decisions together, and more often than you might think, he was following my lead. David just stared at me. I forgive you for what you said today because I know you're grieving too, but I want you to understand something. I didn't become capable and independent when your father died. I've been those things all along, you just never bothered to notice. I gathered my purse and turned toward the door. Mom, David called after me. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I paused with my hand on the doorknob. David, the rental properties, the business, the investments, your father and I built all of that so we could take care of ourselves in our old age and still leave something for you someday. But we also built it so I'd never have to depend on anyone else's opinion of my worth. I opened the door and looked back at him one more time. You might want to remember that $500 monthly payment requires you to maintain respectful contact with me. Your father was very specific about the word respectful. And with that, I walked out of that office and drove myself home to the house that I owned completely, in the car that I had paid for, to begin the next chapter of my life as a woman who had never needed anyone's permission to be exactly who she was. If Margaret's story resonated with you, you're in the right place. Here at Wisdom Strikes Back, we share stories of seniors who refuse to be underestimated and prove that experience is power.